Welcome to today's webinar. My name's Izzy. I'm the Research Operations Manager at the Modern Slavery PEC, and today we're going to be talking to you about our latest funding call on assessing support for children who have lived experience of modern slavery in the UK. Just to start off with a little bit of housekeeping, all participants have their cameras and their audio switched off. Please feel free to use the Q&A function, which you can see if you look along the top banner in Teams. There should be the chat function, room function, then there should be Q&A. So if you look in there, you can ask us questions throughout today's webinar in there. We'll pick those up in the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If you're having technical problems, also please do post those in there and we'll try and do what we can to help get those resolved. You might notice we're recording today's webinar. We're doing this so we can share it online afterwards, so you can always refer back to that video if there's any questions. We're going to record the entire webinar, but we'll only post the presentation portion. We will record the Q&A, but that's just so that we can take accurate notes. We'll write up the Q&A into an FAQ document and we'll post that on the web page. We do have some meeting rules that we ask all participants to follow during our meetings. You can find those in the Q&A section of Teams. There should be a pinned message from myself that outlines what those meeting rules are. The purpose of these is to ensure that we have a safe space where people are able to freely discuss the issues in which we're raising in today's webinar, but we all feel safe doing so. We ask that all attendees observe these meeting rules and just note that if you don't follow those rules, we do reserve the right to remove you from today's webinar. So in terms of the aims today, we're going to give you an introduction to the Modern Slavery PEC, an overview of this particular research call and the application process, and then we'll wrap up and have a Q&A section where you can ask us any questions that you might have. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Alex, who's going to start off with the first part of the webinar around an introduction to the Modern Slavery PEC.
Thanks, Izzy. I'll just take control if I can, of the slides. So welcome everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Alex Bolch, I'm Director of Research at the Modern Slavery PEC. So I'm just going to give you a brief rundown of the Modern Slavery PEC, our mission, and how we work. So we were set up to improve the quality of research by improving understanding of modern slavery across the world, and also to transform the effectiveness of laws and policies. So we have that that dual role of a policy and evidence centre, where we want to improve the quality of evidence and make sure that that evidence makes its way to policymakers. So we are a bit different to normal funders in the sense that we get more involved in the research itself, and that's because we have that that goal of particularly improving the quality of research. So we do get involved in managing the research that we fund, but we also have that engagement aspect as well. So we connect people, we connect researchers with other researchers. We like connecting third sector with academics, but we particularly also work on connecting policymakers and decision makers with the research that we produce. So we work to promote the evidence that we produce. We collaborate and we try and make sure that that research has the maximum possible impact. And that means, a lot of work behind the scenes, building those relationships, building those partnerships, and making sure that the research gets into the right hands at the right time. So we started our work a few years ago now with a consultation process to try and determine what the sort of guiding principles should be to how we conduct our research, and what sort of are the main sort of principles that underpin that research. And we came up with three after a wide consultation with the sector. First one of those is effectiveness. We need to know more about what works and what doesn't work when it comes to policy on modern slavery. The second one is equity, and this sort of reflects the fact that modern slavery as a phenomenon is, a part of the underlying inequalities in society, and discrimination, marginalization, exclusion are all part of that inequitable situation which allows modern slavery to flourish. So we want our research to address those structural issues, but also how we fund research needs to sort of reflect the fact that we need to be more inclusive, more diverse. So equality, diversity and inclusion is really central to how we do our work. We want to make sure that a wide as possible group of people get involved in research and do it in an equitable and fair way. And then finally, survivor involvement. This reflects a strong, I think, desire upon the sector to better include those people most affected. So if you're talking about children in this case, or adults who are affected by these types of exploitation, we should make it absolutely paramount that those people are involved in the research itself. That's through designing the research, conducting the research, leading the research, as well as obviously being part of that research. So those are the three guiding principles that we use to sort of to shape and influence how we do our funding work. We have four main areas which we fund in. The first is victim and survivor support and recovery, then prevention, business supply chains, and the effectiveness of legal enforcement. But we do have a sort of flexible and responsive approach. So if an urgent need comes for new research, then we will respond to that regardless of those four sort of broad priorities. And a good example of that was the COVID-19 pandemic, where we funded 11 projects to look specifically at how modern slavery was being affected by the global pandemic. So that's it for the introduction to the PEC. Am I handing back, Izzy, or am I continuing with the? Yeah, I'm continuing with the overview. So this is the next section is just to give us a bit of a background and rationale and the objectives of this particular research call. So child trafficking guardians, or ICTIGs, as they're often referred to, are an independent source of advice for trafficked children. They're well known in the sector, but they have not yet been rolled out across the whole country. So this is something that in Section 48 of the Modern Slavery Act was a requirement for the Home Office to provide ICTIGs to all potentially trafficked children in England and Wales. But since May 2021, they're only available in 2/3 of local authorities. So what we are thinking of is new research to help inform the rollout of these services. So there have been 3 previous evaluations. So one of the most important things is that what this research does is add additional and is of additional value compared with those previous evaluations, which have all informed the development of the service. One of which included the perspectives of trafficked children, but not all of them. And none of them really addressed comparative impacts of ICTIGs on longer term recovery compared to those who did not have the service. So there are still some gaps in knowledge and the need for new research to inform the future rollout. So the PEC has identified a need for further independent research to address these gaps. So I'll just go through the objectives, and happy to take any questions on these in the Q&A afterwards, or feel free to type Q&A as I'm talking. So the main point of this is to do new research that is co-designed and is flexible and dynamic. And by that we mean that we don't have a specific research project fully defined. So the successful applicant would help us co-design this, but we do have our essential objectives already defined. So the first one is to analyse the nature of modern slavery affecting children in England and Wales with respect to available data sets. The second one is to do qualitative and quantitative research to assess benefits and limitations of ICTIGs on long-term safeguarding protection outcomes, as well as wellbeing recovery indicators for trafficked children. So this is about looking at patterns, looking at outcomes, and seeing how those change over time. And it would mean a period of co-design in collaboration with us at the Modern Slavery PEC and in close working with Barnardo's, who are the organisation that provides the service. So the next objective is to produce evidence-based recommendations. This is something we have on all our funding calls, because ultimately we want the research to be of value to policymakers. So this will help policymakers to improve the service and to improve the outcomes of the service. The fourth, or D, is to support the Modern Slavery PEC's engagement with policymakers. So this means that any successful applicant would need to work with us in terms of that engagement I talked about earlier with decision makers. So that means working with them from the beginning right through the middle and to the end of the work itself. The next one is to actually, as a sort of catch-all, to undertake any duties that may be required. So that means we need to also include other potentially relevant pieces of work in this package, which might include evidence reviews. It might include looking at comparator policy areas or other things like that. Then we have some desirable objectives, which obviously we would like to see in applicants. First one would be to test a model for engaging young people. Now, we're aware that researchers might not have all of these skills, which is why we put this as desirable. So this is something that would be great to have, the ability to engage with young people with lived experience of modern slavery in co-design and delivery of research, and in using participatory research methods. And then the final one is to look at a comparative analysis, which would be working with different local authorities in England and Wales and looking at how different areas have different outcomes for children. So that's it for the essential and desirable objectives. And then I'll just finish off with some advice about making a strong bid. So we get a lot of applications for funding, and we see lots of strengths and weaknesses in those applications. So we have some advice that hopefully is useful. First piece of advice is to be very clear about how you're going to meet the objectives of the call. Secondly, how you're going to deliver in a relatively short time frame. So it's 9 months, which is reasonably short. Thirdly would be about novelty and how this piece of work could be, as I said before, different or in addition to previous research in this area. And finally, examples of how you might meet the criteria in your person specification. So I think that's it from me, and I'll hand back to Izzy.
Thanks very much, Alex. So I'm going to talk us through what the application process looks like now and some of the eligibility and sort of budgetary restrictions that come with this call. So to start off, we'll look at the timelines. So the deadline for applications to this call are 4 p.m. on the 31st of January next year. Applications must be submitted by this deadline through our application form on Submit. The link is on the call webpage for that one. Just make sure that you build in enough time to go to your research office and get costings put together for the call, and leave yourself enough time to email us if you have any questions, so that we've got a good couple of days before the call's coming back, so you have enough time to get all your budgets and everything signed off to submit in time on the 31st. Decisions will be sent out to the successful researcher in February of 2023. Just building upon that advice that Alex was giving in the previous slide, as part of our decision-making process, we'll be including a range of different people reviewing your bids. That might include people with lived experience of modern slavery, practitioners, people from a non-academic background. So just make sure that you're really keeping that in mind when you're putting your application together, and try to use sort of really clear language and make sure it's accessible to people who don't have that academic background. We'll be going through that decision-making process throughout February and looking for a project to start in late March 2023. Now, I've put an asterisk there because we appreciate with this call in particular, we're looking for the right person to undertake this work. So we can have some flexibility, if you've got a teaching workload or you're on a research project that doesn't allow you to have the right time allocation until, for example, April. Don't let that put you off applying. Just be very clear in your application when you can start and why, and the time allocation you can offer at that time, and we can sort of have a bit of flexibility at our end, because we appreciate we're looking for the right individual to carry out this work. The first phase upon the project starting will be a real setup phase. So you'll be meeting people at the Modern Slavery PEC and also at Bernardo's, who you'll be working closely with throughout this project. And that will involve some co-design that Alex was talking about on your methodology and your research tools. And it'll also involve a series of site visits to different sites with Barnardo's to sort of start embedding yourself at that organisation for the next phase, which is your research phase. This is the sort of substantive chunk of work that we were saying roughly from April to October. During this time, you'll be carrying out your research and also having regular catch-ups with both the Modern Slavery PEC and Barnardo's. And at key points, you'll be presenting interim findings back to us and relevant policy makers or decision makers. Then the final phase of the project is the end of project phase, where we'll be working with you really closely to finalise the draft of your report and your research summary. You'll be working closely with the comms team at Modern Slavery PEC and our policy impact team to really make sure that we disseminate and push out your research as well as possible. So we sort of have set aside approximately 3 months for that. So looking at the eligibility for this call, applicants need to be based at either a UK higher education institution, so university, or an approved research organisation that's eligible to receive UKRI funding. And what we mean by that is organisations that are listed on the UKRI website as approved research organisations. You can see here I've included that you either need to be based at or have a letter of support to cover your employment for the duration of the fellowship from one of these organisations. So that is basically to say, if you're not currently employed by, for example, a university, but you have an agreement that should your application be successful, then employ you for the duration of the project, you would still meet this eligibility criteria. But what we need to see in your application is a letter of support from the head of school or head of department, ideally from head of school, just outlining that support that they'll offer you for the duration of the research, just to basically make sure that you have that institutional coverage, because we will be working with your institution's ethics procedures, for example, or procurement procedures. So you do need to be based at an organisation to do this work. Applicants need to be able to commit 0.6 to 1 FTE full-time equivalent throughout the project's duration. So that's 3 to 5 days of work per week. This can fluctuate throughout the fellowship. So it might be that in that setup phase for that first month, you do 3 days a week, and then you do 5 days a week for the bulk of the research phase, and then go back down to perhaps 4 days a week for the write-up and dissemination phase. That's totally up to you. Could be that you apply for full-time for 5 days a week for the duration of the project. That's at your discretion. We will accept applications for the fellowship as a role share. We ask that both applicants submit their own separate application, but in your personal spec or just somewhere on your application, just specify that this is a linked application and who the application is linked with. You need to make sure that between the two applications you cover that 0.6 to 1 full-time equivalent for the duration of the project, and that also your budgets don't exceed the 100k limit that we have set. Applicants can only apply once, so that means if you're applying as an individual, you can't also apply as a role share, or you can't apply on 2 different role share applications, like you just submit one. But there's no limit to the number of applications that an eligible organisation can submit. So if, for example, there are 5 applications from one research organisation for different individuals, that's no problem at all. So in terms of the funding that's available, there's a maximum budget of £100,000 at 100% of full economic cost for this project. This is paid at standard UKRI rates. So this means that for every £1 that's spent, we'll reimburse 80 pence of that £1. If you're new to research funding and that seems a bit strange, that's really standard for research projects that are funded through UK Research and Innovation. And what I would recommend is that you go to your research office and ask them to help sort of as early as possible in putting your budget together, because we tend to follow standard UK Research and Innovation budgeting rules. They should be quite used to how we've put our budgets together. But if they do have any questions, they can email me and I can answer those on a case-by-case basis. We expect to fund 1 fellowship for this work, and as I've said already, that could be 1 individual or a role share. Just to note that costs for equipment are not eligible under this call. That's not that's because we'll make sure that you're provided with the correct equipment that you need. Bernardo's in particular has a fully virtual office, so we just need to make sure you've got the right equipment to be able to collaborate with our colleagues there. So felt that it was easier to just provide that equipment for you instead of asking you to try and sort of estimate what that cost might look like. So just make sure that if you did that, you don't put any costs for equipment in your application. But we do encourage that you put costs for your travel and subsistence. You need to make sure that you're able to attend all of the site visits that we've outlined in the core documents. That's approximately 10 site visits throughout the duration of the project. So just to make sure that, especially given the current climate and the price of train tickets and travel, that you make sure you really budget sort of accurately for that, so that you've got enough money within your budget to be able to attend all of those site visits. So just to wrap up, I was going to do a really high level overview of what 2 different types of budgets might look like. I think these should just come with a bit of a health warning that these are really zoomed out high level examples, and that our budget template is does require slightly more detail. You can see in the first example that I've got here, that's for if you're applying on your own as without doing a role share. So we've got the staff costs and overheads at 90k, and then the cost of travel and to site visits at 2.5k. So together 92k, so that's fully within budget. Where things are slightly more complex is where we're looking at scenario 2, which would be a joint fellowship. So each applicant would submit their own budget. So you just need to make sure that between the 2 of you, you don't exceed 100k. So for this example here, we have somebody submitting their staff and overhead costs and their travel costs, totaling 47,000. Assuming the other applicant is also on 47,000, you're well within budget. I think that concludes our presentation section for today. So we'll move on to the Q&A.